This is Nick Christophers from Mob Tales. Hope you guys are doing well. Um, have a very special guest today. We went out of the country for a change, and we got a Canadian gentleman who has been involved in the underbelly of Canada, and he has a very interesting story. So I'd like to welcome Germano Tomassetti to the show. I hope I said that right. I'm not even Italian. I'm Greek, so I think I said that pretty good.
No, you pronounced it perfectly. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No, thank you. Actually, your name, Germano, in Greek means German.
Yeah, same as Italian. Yep,
Yeah,
same.
I figured that.
Yeah,
Well, just to let everybody know a little bit about you, uh, Germano comes from Winnipeg.
yeah,
It's sort of like smack in the middle of Canada, in between Ontario and I think it's Quebec, if I'm correct. And he was involved with a lot of wise guys and a lot of other crew members in that area, and has a very interesting story to tell. And I do have a couple of questions for you, Germano, to
absolutely.
start off the interview.
Yeah,
Uh, I know if I'm correct, you grew up in Winnipeg,
yeah. I was born and raised here. Yeah,
right? And your bloodline is Calabrese.
yeah. So it's a little complicated. I'm half Italian. I got half of that comes from Calabria, Reggio Calabria, and the other half comes from Abruzzo, and then my other half I'm Irish.
Oh, okay, but that's all Italian. It's Italy.
Well, half. Yeah, my father was Italian. My mother was Irish.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
gotcha. Okay.
yeah,
Um, well, if anybody sees you, the first thing they're going to say, you look Italian. Hey,
yeah,
there's a good Irish guy.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, now I understand growing up, you grew up with a lot of different. See, in Winnipeg, it's kind of a mixed bag of different crews. It's not
It
just
is. Yeah,
it's everybody. You got a
yeah,
little bit of you have the Italians, you got the bikers, you got the
yeah,
some, I guess, Ukrainians, some Filipino, all that
yeah,
kind of a mix.
yeah.
And so when what first of all, what really drew you to that world? Like what drove you to go to that other side of the tracks?
So, yeah, again, growing up in Winnipeg, the street element, like that was probably the first thing that I engaged with. And to be honest, in my teenage years and even my early adult years, I was just around a lot of guys. So I was around like a lot of African gangs. I was a lot of Arab gangs. They're pretty big out here. Same as Aboriginal, like the natives out here. They're
Mhm.
also pretty heavy. Um, but I was just always kind of around these guys. Like, I dabbled in certain things, right? Like I hustled a little bit when I was younger, but I didn't like it. I decided from an early age that I didn't really want to get involved in drugs because it had affected my family. And I also saw going into my early adult years just the time that people were getting for drugs. You know what I mean? So I quickly decided like that's not for me, but I was always around it. I was always around gangs, the streets, drugs, and then eventually got into clubs and stuff like that as well.
But I think, but again, but I think your specialty, I believe,
Hmm.
was more into scams and money laundering, things of that nature. Like if I remember correctly, you had bank accounts in like 7 different continents, and you were very good at moving money around, and that's pretty impressive to begin with.
Yeah.
And being the case,
Hmm.
so were you tapped by different crews, different organizations, especially Italian, were they to utilize your skills? Did that happen?
So really what happened, like the time that I got into like serious crime where I started actually making money and started traveling and doing all these crazy things wasn't until I was about 26 or 27. So again, I had dabbled in a little bit of everything, little scams like, no money in an envelope, go cash it, like drugs, like little tiny stuff. But it wasn't until I went through this period that I was homeless that I basically met like a Sicilian man that was from Quebec, but he's hiding out in my city. At the time, there had been a huge Canada-wide and Italy-wide like joint operation, like basically a bust, and a lot of these guys got scooped up, and some of them went on the lam. So some of them either like left the country, and some just kind of disappeared into the prairies or into the West Coast, like British Columbia, Vancouver, and stuff. All the
Mhm.
guys from the East Coast. So I met a guy through there, and what started it out for me really was debt collections. So through this man, I basically got connected with somebody else that was in Quebec that had some business in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, in Ontario, all over the place. And I started just doing little debt collections. And I was not an enforcer. I was not the guy that was beating people up. It was nothing like that. It was just I was more of a mediator. I was the guy that was sent in to try and, talk some sense before it went to the next level, right? So that was my real introduction to like organized crime. Um, at the time, I was doing, I came from homelessness and poverty, so like I basically went from being broke to making $8,000 to $10,000 a month, which was huge for me. I'd never seen that kind of money in my life, and everything was good. I didn't really have any problems. I never got beat up. I never had to beat anybody up, other than like one time, this small occasion with some guy that I went to high school with. But other than that, it was pretty uneventful. The reason why I got out of that later on was just because I guess the organization that I was working for, they were getting more paranoid, and they were worried about some of these guys that were collecting for them either yeah, getting beat up or shot, or money getting stolen, whatever it was, getting robbed. So they asked me to start carrying a piece, and I told them I didn't want to. Like when I originally signed up for this, it was literally just like a couple of times a week I'd go knock on some doors, have a conversation, and like I said, it was very uneventful. And then when you start adding, a pistol into the mix, it changes the whole element. You know what I mean? So I was kind of out of there as soon as I could. Um, I also heard from someone that was connected here in Winnipeg that these guys were starting to really like me, and it just kind of sounded like I was going to be asked to do other things. So whether that was enforcing or drugs or whatever else, I wasn't interested in any of that. So the second I could, I basically took off and started traveling. For a year, I was in a couple places in Latin America, and then 2017, January 2017. I went to Italy for the first time, and that's where I basically started the next chapter of what I was doing in the criminal life.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah,
Um, but excuse me,
yeah,
a lot of people think, and because I have other stuff to ask in reference to what you just said,
for
but
sure.
just on a side note, see,
Yeah,
I think a lot I grew up around guys like you,
yeah,
more or less. I got out of that at a very young age.
yeah,
After I got pinched when I was 21, I kind of, it made you think, and you like kind of walked away from it, thank God.
yeah.
Uh, but when a lot of people, I think, have a misconception that
Hmm.
when debt collectors, like you
Yeah,
just said,
yeah.
like when you borrow money, people get beat up all the time. It's not to me. I know that's not true.
No,
And
it's not.
9 out of 10, most of the guys, the bosses or the captains or whoever, don't really want the other guy to get beat up because they're never going to get the money. If you beat them up, you kill them, how are you ever going to get your money back?
Yeah,
So, does that sound accurate?
yeah. Well, and especially here because Canadian organized crime culture is so different from the U.S. I'll tell you that right now.
Yeah,
And even though today a lot of the murders that are happening more in Canada than they are in the
yeah,
U.S. with the Italian organized crime groups, on
true.
a smaller level, though, on a smaller level, Canadian organized criminals try to avoid violence as much as possible.
Right. Yeah, I would assume so. I mean,
Yeah,
see, I know in Canada, um, not to divert from what I was going to ask you, but I know
yeah,
especially like in Montreal or Quebec or Ontario, um, they were very, even to this day, I think, are still very traditionally based. They don't
100%.
they don't really divert and become very like, over here, they become a little too modern with a couple of
Yeah.
things, and it's hurt them in a big way.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that even though down here in New York, when I've talked to guys in the life or have been, they say those guys are Canadians. Those guys are crazy. You
Yeah.
know, they're nuts. If you
Yeah.
imagine, meaning if you piss them off,
Yep.
they're not going to even think twice. They're going to do what they got to do.
No, and you know what? Like there's a lot of that culture, that real old school Italian mob culture where it's like they say like Italians forgive but they don't forget. So I know some stories of like and this is like basically folklore out here, but like debts, whether that was like a beef between two guys or whether it was money related or whatever, sometimes scores get settled like 20, 30 years later. Like that's how they hold on to things over here. You know what
That's
I mean? It's
crazy.
very traditional, old
Yeah,
school.
that's scary. Think
Yeah, it
about
is. Yeah,
it.
definitely. Yeah.
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 Well, like we mentioned earlier about how you were able to um, knew how to work with money, knew how to move it around. Like
Yeah.
from what I understand, you had a lot of you managed to create accounts in Panama,
Yeah.
and
That was, yeah. Yeah.
you had a few accounts, not one. You had a couple of
Yeah.
banking accounts. Now,
Yeah.
what I'm interested in is how did you manage to do that thing without leaving a paper trail? Like
A
how
digital trace. Yeah.
like how did you manage that?
Yeah, so for me, and I want to be very clear in this because my story is relatively new. Like the first podcast that I ever did was back in November of last year. I
Mhm.
only started talking about the stuff recently, so a lot of people don't know much about my story, but the reality is I was a connector and I took a fee off of what I did, right? So how I got into money laundering, before I started money laundering, I'll just quickly express through this. I got into embezzlement probably around 2017, 2016. I had a couple of Canadian companies where we had control of the companies. We had the chief financial officers cutting checks, doing direct deposits, setting up payable accounts, all that kind of stuff for us. And then what happened was when I made that trip to Italy, I got connected with somebody with a collaborating group in Milan that basically was connected to this family that I knew back in Canada. And through this relationship, I started to learn about money laundering. And I was introduced to the idea through, the boss of a family that basically introduced me to a Lebanese guy that was out in Panama and that was doing this, right? So that's how it started for me. And obviously, this took several months. It wasn't like I just sat down once and this guy's like, hey, here's the business. That's not how it works. We had a good relationship, and these guys knew that I was like a little bit shady, a little sketchy in the sense that, I was obviously doing some criminal stuff, but I wasn't talking about it. I wasn't flexing. That's another thing with Canadian criminals. Like, well, not all of them. Like, there's some egomaniacs, but for me, in the whole 7, 8 years that I was really involved in everything, I never owned a house. I never owned a car. I didn't wear jewelry. I didn't wear Gucci. I was not that kind of guy. I wasn't loud. And a lot of Canadians are like that. And that's why a lot of them, maintain the life for such a long period of time. And so what ends up happening is this guy that I sit down with several times introduces me to the idea of Panama about moving money and stuff like that. And I had so many friends back home in Canada from all types of different ethnic groups, not just Italians, like Jamaicans, Syrians, like wherever you could think of. And a lot of these guys, they were drug dealers or whatever else, and they needed to move money, but they are not international. They don't know these kind of people. A lot of them are just hustlers on the streets. They don't even know what to do with their money. So this guy introduces me to this idea. And then the real point that I had to go to Panama originally, which would be in 2019, was actually to set up a safety deposit box for myself in one of these banks that, was basically corrupted. So I originally went there not even to launder money. I went there to basically just drop off some cash that I wanted to have in that part of the world in case shit ever hit the fan, or I just needed it because I was spending a lot of time in Latin America by then. So, yeah, I went down there for that, and I basically got a breakdown of Panama, which to me is like Vegas in a way. Like there's so much organized crime there, like from the Chinese to Italians to the Colombians, like everybody's in Panama. I met like South African mercenaries and like just everybody's out there, you know what I mean? So when I get out there, I deposit a little bit of money and then I basically get the breakdown of this system. And this is the system that I used for about 3 years, from like 2019 to 2021, 2022. And the system is, and this is just what I did, and I can speak about this now because it's over with. And obviously, I'm not going to say, if you listen to any of my other podcasts, I don't say names, I don't say organizations, I never will. And a big key thing I want to state this as well because I've never really said this really in detail. I've never informed, I've never ratted, and I've never been arrested for the crimes that I'm talking about. And that makes me extremely unique. Most of the guys that are on these podcasts have either given proffers or they're informants or whatever else. And I don't have anything bad to say about these guys, but that's not me. So I'm not going to get on here and say Joe Schmoed showed me this at this corporation and blah, blah, blah. I'm
Yeah.
just not that kind of guy, right? But what I will say is that basically through this Lebanese guy that had a bunch of businesses and real estate and stuff all over Latin America. We had this company that was, yeah, it was a real estate company, and they had this scheme going on where they had basically bought land to build these glass condos, and it was fake. It was a dud. So what it was is they went through all the proper channels legally. They got the land, they got the permits, they did all the I guess the ground based construction or whatever, but there was never any real intention to actually build the condos. What they were going to do was use this company and this project to launder money. So what I ended up doing was getting people from Canada that would buy condos for whatever it could be 150,000 USD, 250,000, whatever it was like that, and the throughout, like in the process, basically the money would be moved to Panama as a legitimate sale. There'd be paperwork on it, everything like that. But it was a short-term thing where the money was going to be pulled out and either put into, depending on the person and what they wanted, turned into cash. Some people turned it into gold. Some people actually bought real estate in Panama. They just wanted to move their dirty money from usually Canada over to Panama. And we did that for like, yeah, 3 years more or less. And I just
So,
took a percentage.
so those are what we call shell companies, in other
Yeah,
words.
shell. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I mean, it's like somebody would be listening to this, and they'd be like,
Hmm.
"Look, this guy never got pinched. How's that
Yeah.
possible?" Now,
Yeah.
say somebody would say that, right? Like, well,
Yeah.
how?
Well, and they do.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I mean,
Yeah.
even I'm wondering how the hell they do this and
Yeah.
not get pinched. Um, Now, wouldn't that concern you? I mean, even to even divulge even the smallest idea or item of your life, to even divulge anything like that, without, of course, not saying names, of course, but
Yeah.
doesn't that worry you a little bit? Like, let's say somebody listening to, oh, maybe we go after this guy. He's actually, he said he did this and he did that, he did this.
Yeah.
Would you have some concern?
Of course. Of course. There's always, there's like, I'm just being realistic. When I started writing my book last July, I accepted that as a possibility. And if you read like the first page even of the book, it's called The Winnipeg Story. It's on
Yeah.
Amazon.
Mhm.
Yeah. If you read it, I even say I accepted like the responsibilities and the risks of me telling my story from the beginning. But I also said that regardless of the consequences and the outcome, I'll keep my mouth shut and deal with what I got to deal with. Now, to get back to your last question,
Mhm.
like, um, for me, the thing, the reason why I was able to do what I did for about 7 or 8 years, because that's how long this run lasted. I never had my name on anything. So whether that was a real estate or one of the shell companies. I never had any money transferred internationally to me in Canada. I would get my stuff in cash, or I would have it, other ways. I would have it brought to me. And yeah, I didn't have my name on anything. So yeah, there's still a risk of me talking about it and breaking things down. But I will also say, for anyone that's listening with law enforcement or whoever else, is that I've also told lies throughout my story, right? I've said lies throughout the podcast, and what I mean by that is that if everything I'm saying to you right now is 95% true, there's 5% that's fabricated. But the reason that it's fabricated is not to exaggerate, it's to hide something, right? So I might be breaking this down for you, but who knows? Did I really use a real estate company or did I use something else, right? So
Yeah.
that's another way I've already learned to layer and protect myself. Again, anything can happen, but I've also thought about it for months and done it very strategically. So I feel okay.
Well, now in modern day now, 2024,
Yeah,
a lot of people say that the mob is dying. I mean, especially in America, that
yeah,
I don't believe it's out, but it's not
yeah,
in, not much either. Um, if from your experience, and because your experience is very current,
yeah,
than than what a lot of other guys that I've interviewed who were part of the life back in the 80s or the 90s. So you're a little more current. And
yeah.
in your perspective, do you believe the mob in general, Italians specifically, are in on the outs where other crews, like you mentioned, the native or gangs, or the Russian mob, or the Yakuza, or the Triads, or any of those in general, have? Do you believe that the traditional mob is on the outs, and these other crews are coming up to almost replace them?
Okay, so there's three answers to that. And the three answers are three different places: Canada, US, and Italy. Okay. So I'm gonna start with Italy first.
Mhm.
The Italian organized groups over there, whether it's in Naples, Sicily, Calabria, they're more powerful than they've ever been, in my opinion. And
Really?
that's 100%. You have to understand the biggest thing with me, I'm from Winnipeg, I'm from Canada, but the relationships that I had and the activity that I saw was international, right? I'm not a crazy connected guy here in my city. Some people know me or know my family members or whatever, but I'm not some crazy gangster, well known, whatever. But the contacts that I made overseas and what I learned overseas is another thing that makes my story a little bit more unique. What I will tell you for sure, the Calabrians still have the cocaine market in Europe and they're dominating in other parts of the world as well.
Mm.
So that hasn't changed. The Sicilians are still very strong, and they're most of these groups are on almost every continent in the world. So the Italians, absolutely not. They're not fading away at all. They're getting stronger, and you have to keep in mind the thing that is so special about these Italian groups that a lot of other ethnic groups don't have is their relationships. And I'm talking about the drug game mostly because that's the most profitable thing is cocaine, right? So their connections with Latin America are beyond anybody in the world, Russians, Mexicans, whoever else. And the reason why is because a lot of these clans from back home, from Italy, from the motherland, these guys will actually go into places like Venezuela, Colombia, wherever else, and they'll marry into cartel groups because a lot of these Italian organized crime groups, they're all about blood and family. So the best thing that you can do is tie yourself in with these guys by marrying in. So these guys have been doing it for, 50, 60 years, some of them, especially the Sicilians. I think the Sicilians were the first ones to really do it. The Calabrians are now into it more because of their relationship with the Colombian cartels and the Mexicans and their reach around the world. But yeah, so as far as Italians from Italy, they're stronger than they've ever been. Um, the U.S. now this is tricky to talk about because the reality is the mob culture in the US is so pop culture as well. And there's a lot of egos and macho-ness that comes with it. But the reality is, the biggest difference that I've seen between Canadians and American Italians is that Canadians, first of all, everybody says this as well. Even the Americans say this. I've heard this on 1,000 different podcasts. We're more traditional, first of all, and we're a lot more like the guys from back home. We're a lot more quiet, and we're a lot more international. So, for instance, a lot of the guys that I met regularly made trips to Italy, Germany, Colombia, wherever. Now, a lot of, not all of them, but as far as I know, and the history books tell, a lot of the Italian organized crime figures and crews in the U.S. were mostly U.S. based, and they worked with Canada. Sometimes they worked with Mexico. Sometimes they had offshore accounts or whatever else, but
Mhm.
they weren't moving around like that in the world. So I think what's happened is that if you don't focus on those international relationships, those ties, and not doing what everybody else from your neighborhood is doing, then it's very easy to get swallowed by all these other groups, especially when immigration is such a huge issue right now in the US. And you have all these foreign groups from these refugee countries and Latin American countries flooding in. And these guys come from nothing. You got to keep in mind that the Italian organized groups or any of the big ones, Chinese, Russian, whatever, they come from poverty. They come from, you know, Calabria was a land where it was just farming and there was no industry and no economical infrastructure. So you get people that are so hungry, that have seen war, that have seen real poverty, like starvation, and they come into a place like US. It's very easy for them to dominate because they're used to a level of violence that frankly is not there when it comes to organized crime groups anymore. You know what I mean? Like in the US. Because like I've heard and seen on a lot of podcasts that in the States, with a lot of the Italian organized crime groups, the violence has come down, and that order comes from the top because
Yeah.
these guys are getting so much time for not just murder. It doesn't always have to be murder, but sometimes extortion or whatever else. That it's like it's not even worth this to be violent anymore. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, they kind of, that is true. They actually made a rule back in, I think, 92, 93, that
Mm-hmm.
we stop making this, let's stop making the papers. Let's start making the
Right.
news. You know,
Yeah.
it's attracting too much law enforcement. It's
Yeah.
attracting too much attention. So that is true. That did happen in the US. And that's still actually, it's still the case. You never hear
Yeah.
anybody getting whacked in the US anymore. It just doesn't really
Yeah.
happen.
No, not often. No.
They're
Yeah.
afraid, they're afraid of law enforcement. The law enforcement has really, you know, it's the technology is really advanced. You can't even
Yeah.
breathe, you can't like sneeze in New York and then them not knowing about it. It's
Yeah.
incredible. Um, Now to get on to something different, not
Mhm.
different, but to talk about your book, Winnipeg Story.
Yeah.
Um, to give us a little bit of, I know it's about your life
Yeah.
story, and everything.
Hmm.
Um, and what differentiates it from a lot of other books, I believe, would be the fact that you really don't, you don't divulge any names or any specifics. You're a little bit elusive about it
Yeah.
for a reason, which makes sense.
Yeah.
And that is very different than any other book, because other books that other guys write that have been in their life,
Yeah.
hey, they they mention everything and everybody. Um,
Yeah.
so now, for somebody like me, I love reading, and I've read every book on the subject, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Um, what would, what do you think is going to be the draw for readers of that genre if
Yeah.
they pick up to read Winnipeg Story, even though it doesn't give them names, places, stuff like that, that people do like to read about. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
mention that guy's name. Oh shit, I know about him. But
Yeah.
what do you think will be the draw for people to pick up Winnipeg Story?
Okay. So here's one thing. even though we've gotten into this culture where it's so normal to talk and to say names and everything like that, there's still a huge audience of people that love mystery as well, right?
Mhm.
So what I think draws people into the book is definitely the crime and the stories and the money and the traveling and stuff like that. Now that is talked about, and it's talked about more in detail than I've even done on some podcasts. Like, it's not a long book. You can get through it in a couple hours if you really sit down with it, but it does break down things a little bit differently than I do, like, let's say, on, on the show with you.
Mhm.
Um but what I think makes the book really different is, like, the crime part is probably only 30% of the book. Like, I talk about a lot of other things, from, like, I experienced homelessness. I've lost both of my parents in my life. My ex-wife I met at a Colombian cartel club and basically got her out of there, and got married in the Bahamas. Like, there's so much stories in that book that are even outside of, well, I guess that's not really outside of the crime aspect, but there's so much that people can relate to. I think that people are drawn to it for the crime, but then once they see the soul of the book and the human story, I
Yeah.
think that's what really gets people emotionally attached to it.
Oh, so I got you. So it has a human element to it that,
That's the base for me, you
yeah,
know. The
yeah.
crime life is the draw, the other stuff is the real base, the heart, the soul.
Well, just to, not to, not, I know we're getting close to the time for the show, but
Yeah,
there's two things I did want to ask you. One
sure.
thing I want to mention is that your ex-wife that you mentioned is,
Mhm.
from the Columbia, you saved her life basically, if I'm correct.
Yeah, like, it wasn't like a dire, like, guns drawn situation, but yeah, I took her out of a really bad place. Luckily, she had only been there for a few weeks, and I didn't have real conflict on taking her out, but it could have been another way, and I was ready to go all the way. At the time, I had, like, a guy with me that was an ex special forces in Canada, a sniper. I had contacts in Latin America at that time with immigration, with police, with obviously some of the cartels and organized crime groups. So, like, in my mind, I was ready to go all the way with this. Luckily, I didn't have to, but
Hmm.
yeah, I got her out of that place, and I'd like to think that I did something good by doing that.
Oh, okay, nice. All right.
Mhm.
Now the other question is just, it's an offside question.
Sure.
Where me being Greek,
Yeah.
I know there was a Greek element in Canada, especially Montreal
Oh
or
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Toronto.
Yeah.
Um, uh, did you ever deal with that element, the Greek ethnic group?
No, but a lot of the guys that I was working with were constantly doing things with Greeks. And you have to understand that even though just that little percentage of me is Calabrian, like, that's what dominates my, I don't know, my essence, my character. Like, if somebody asks me what's your background, I'll say I'm Italian. I don't even say that I'm Irish. It's just I don't relate to that. That's not how I grew up culturally. That's not what I'm drawn to. And then if someone's like, you know, what are you from Italy? I say Calabrian. Like, I don't even say I'm Abruzzese.
Yeah.
So for me, in Calabrian culture and history, we have a huge connection with the Greeks, right? Like, that's a lot of Greeks came over to Calabria and Sicily, right? So there's always a almost like a kindredship between Calabrians, Sicilians, and Greeks. I met some Greeks overseas that were doing some pretty big things. But as far as I know, um, yeah, like you said, Montreal, Quebec, and even Ontario as well, Toronto and other places. These guys are pretty big out there. Like, they're into real estate. I seen them in the Bahamas as well. I seen them in a lot of pockets in different parts of the world, and they were always just like um, low key, business savvy. Always had real estate. Always had restaurants, and they had delicious food. Obviously, love Greek food. But yeah, they were the most relatable, like, for me, like, as just on a character level, Greeks, and then later on Albanians, oddly enough. But yeah, I love the Greeks.
Oh, is there, well, one more comment? I said you just brought something up I wanted to ask you. and now
Sure.
you reminded me. The
Yeah.
Albanians
Yeah.
have taken a major hold, organized crime-wise, in Winnipeg, if I'm correct.
Yeah. So that was kind of like, okay, the way that that was discussed and chopped up, it wasn't, it's not, they haven't taken a hold of Winnipeg. So they're out here in Canada. I've seen some of them popping up in Winnipeg. But what, for me, I just like kind of, how can I explain this better? I just noticed their impact on North America, but after I saw it internationally. So like they're getting in really heavy in Europe right now. And because of all these pickups with the Calabrians getting busted, and the coke routes changing, you know, whether it's West Africa or North Africa or Colombia, Ecuador, whatever, the Albanians are kind of capitalizing on, you know, anytime a group's kind of suffers, or I heard this thing happens in the US where like, or it did happen like in the glory days of organized crime where like one crew would be like just completely assaulted by the feds, and you know everyone would get picked up or whatever, and then the other group would go in and kind of dominate, and that would happen a lot. So that's what the Albanians are currently doing in Europe. And they're also starting to get into South America, and they're starting to build those relationships with the cartels as well. So they're a heavy force for sure.
Yes, I thought
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I know we come in time to for the time limit, so to speak.
Yeah.
I know I could talk to you forever.
Oh,
Uh,
definitely. And I think we will talk again,
yeah,
probably
yeah,
for a
for
longer
sure,
period of time. Yeah. Yeah.
definitely. But for people who are interested in getting Winnipeg story, the place to go is Amazon. Am I correct?
Yeah, so you could, yeah, the best way to do it is just go to Amazon, type in a Winnipeg story or type in Germano, it'll come up. And then also I want to just drop this as well, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah,
I just got back 3 4 days ago from Spain, filming a documentary, and
nice.
by the end of the year into early next year, that should be out, and we're hoping for Amazon Prime or HBO, someone like that, to pick it up.
Oh, that's awesome. Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
we're gonna have to keep tabs on that. That's for sure.
for
Uh,
sure. Yeah,
yeah. Well, Germano, as we say in Greek.
yeah,
It's a pleasure having you on the show.
yeah,
Uh, thank you very much, and I wish you a lot of luck in what you're doing, and
yeah.
especially the fact that you're you're staying on the straight and narrow, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, definitely. When I walked away from everything, which you know we'll talk about another time, but when I made that choice, I got out completely.
Oh,
Yeah,
good. Good for you. Well, I
yeah,
wish you luck, and we'll definitely speak soon.
yeah. You as well, Nick. Thank you for having me. Ciao.
No, thank you. Well, guys, that was another segment of Mob Tales. Please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment, and hope to speak to you guys next time.